Hey, it's Dr. Johnson. Just wanted to take a quick minute to talk about that question. What is social studies? You're going to have a great first year of teaching, but one of the things you're going to need to know is what are you going to teach? You're going to have all these students in front of you. What is it that you actually need to teach them, whether that's online or face-to-face or whatever route you go? My first year of teaching in elementary school was great. I knew exactly what I was going to teach in math. I knew that the sixth graders that I had were going to need to know division and multiplication. I knew that we were going to be doing other topics in math. We were going to do some graphing, some estimating. We were going to do fractions. It was pretty easy to understand the main topics in math. And in science, it was the same way. I knew that in science there was some chemistry we were going to do. We were going to study some rocks and minerals. We were going to do some biology. Pretty easy to define what those topics in science were. But when it came to social studies, I really didn't know what the main topics of social studies were. And I didn't have Google to go search it out. So I'm going to ask you that question right now, and what I want you to do is pause your video here in just a moment, get a piece of paper and pencil out, and write down for me what you think the main topics of social studies are. So pause your video, and we'll be back in just a minute. Write those down. What are the main topics of social studies? And we're back. Hopefully you've got some really interesting things written down. I'm going to bring up at least what I think the 5 that most commonly show up out there are. Move my picture out of the way. These are the big 5, I would call them. A lot of people will have history on their list. Social studies is history, or culture. Geography is a big one. We teach geography. That's social studies. Some people get political science and civics in there, and economics is one that kind of shows up on most people's lists. And this is, by the way, not an all-inclusive list, but I want you to start thinking about what it is we actually teach in social studies. And to help us out with that, we've got some help here from the state of Hawaii. They have some interesting ideas for what social studies is. So I brought up the main topics that they had. So here's from 2005 to 2018. These were the main topics of social studies for Hawaiian elementary school students. Cultural anthropology kind of surprised me when I first started here. I hadn't seen that in a curriculum. Now in 2018 they changed those topics, and let's see here if I can get the computer to move on. In 2018 they narrowed it down to only 4 topics. But don't panic, because there's more to social studies than just these basic topics. There are themes, and so I want to introduce you to these themes of social studies. These are from the National Council for the Social Studies. Themes are kind of like topics. Like you can see number 1 there, culture. But themes kind of encompass lots of different topics into it. For instance, take science, technology, and society. How does science and technology change and affect society? How does the development of that do that? Well, there's some history in there. You have to know some history. But there's also some economics on how companies like Apple have affected the world and how devices have changed our world. So there's some civics, how we interact with things. So themes are not just individual topics. They're how things interact. Let's take one more theme up here. Let's take a look at time continuity and change. This is primarily a history type of a theme. How have things changed over time? But how have things stayed the same? And how do we react to how things are different and the same? How do we react to windmills built in Kahuku? How do we react to travel restrictions that have been put in place? And in fact, we look at maybe the impact of COVID, and here's a book, More Deadly Than War. It's about the 1919 flu pandemic and how that changed the world. So we look at history and see how it affects us, how this time continuity and change makes different effects. So themes, more comprehensive than topics, and they can include several topics. In fact, themes kind of go back to a very traditional model of social studies, which kind of came from this theorist called Uri Bronfenbrenner, who always studied about how the child interacts with the systems, he called them, around him. So, the child may interact with himself, but then he has family that he directly interacts with, may directly interact with a school or a doctor's office. But then there are other things that influence them, like the neighborhood or the country they live in. Other things that they may not directly interact with that still influences them. So, kind of given that theory, this idea that social studies in kindergarten started out with studying the self, kind of meets up with this theorist. And then in first grade, we always taught about your neighborhood and your neighborhood around you. And then we talked about your community and city. We get a little bit wider on this influence. And in third grade, your county. And in fourth grade, this is still a classic in the United States to talk about your state. Fourth grade was the grade you study your state, all about California, all about Texas. In fifth grade is usually U.S. history in the United States, and it might be in other countries as well. And sixth grade always seemed to be typically a world view. So those are kind of topical based, but they're also thematic based. And speaking to themes, here are the main themes that we're going to be getting into as we look at what the Hawaii State curriculum is. So we're not going to look at these much right now, but just know that there are some themes like second grade, people now and then, places near and far. We'll look at how these themes help define specific things that you're going to teach in social studies. So back to that original question, what is social studies? Well, social studies is a whole bunch of different things. It's studying history, to learn about history, but not just to learn about history, but to learn how our students maybe could be more compassionate and interact with cultures and people that aren't like them. Social studies is about civics and protesting, but not just to study what's happening in the world, but to help our students learn how they can make a difference in topics that affect them. And social studies is about political science, the Hawaii State Legislature in this case. But not just learning about the legislature, but learning how maybe in our own classroom we can make rules in our classroom that everyone can agree upon and live with and understand consequences and actions from. And social studies is looking at maps, geography and economics, and understanding how food is produced in different areas of our local region, and then being able to understand that as part of the world around us. So when we go to the store, we understand where that food comes from. And it might be about civics and debate, a big topic right now. But that's really important in a classroom because we use debate and we use civil discussions on managing conflict. How do we interact with one another so we can have good classrooms and good communities? Because to me, social studies is really about building a community. It's all the topics that come together, all the history, the civics, the political science, the geography, that help us create a community of our classroom, in this case, my 26 students, and me, and my student teacher, and my parents, and everyone involved. So hopefully that gives you a good introduction to at least what I think social studies is, and gives you some interesting things to think about.